We have a new photocopier that anytime you start with something new, there's a learning curve. And I was going to add another page, a fourth page, and got this one going, and I wasn't going to throw away the copies that we have. So I'd like you to turn to it's the third page. It says, what is the most frequently mentioned command in the Bible? Like I said, on the very back is just some little bit. I was going to actually print a song, but I didn't want to throw away the ones that were done. I was in a chapel service in Memphis, and one of our long-term workers in France came to chapel that day, and he just asked an open-ended question, and I just really didn't have an answer to it. He just simply said, what is the most frequently listed commandment in the Bible? And you kind of start doing this computer search in your mind and thinking, okay, what is it? And I would never have guessed, but his thought, and if not the most, at least it's very frequently given, one of the most frequently given commandments in the Bible is, don't be afraid. Like I said, I would never have picked that in a fit, because you kind of do this computer search in your mind and you're thinking all these different things. And he just said, and I just mentioned it here, in the NIV, it's mentioned at least 70 times. Don't be afraid. And then you start adding things about, fear not, and on it goes, and there's a wide variety of those. He also made the statement, he said, and I wonder if Jesus' statement, be of good cheer, is the positive way of saying don't be afraid. One of the things that happened with our kids growing up in Australia is that I tell people American humor, if you think of Bob Hope, it's always front hand. Australian humor is always backhand. Just by nature, a lot of Irish things. And you ask an American how he's doing, he says, I'm doing great. And you ask an Australian, he'll say, oh, not so bad. And so one said, I'm doing great, and the other said, not so bad. And they said exactly the same thing, but they came at the point from kind of a totally different point of view. But here's what I want you to just stop and think about it. Why would one of the most frequently given commandments in the Bible be, don't be afraid? And we're not going to completely answer that tonight, but I just wanted to kind of plant that seed in your mind just to stop and think about. And just some preliminary things. And I put this in a bold, kind of right close to the middle. What does fear do to us both physically and spiritually? So I know we're spread out, and the auditorium is not your best discussion type class, but help me a little bit. What does fear do to us physically? It drains you. Help me. Just a growing sense of just anxiety that can be a burden of that. Sorry, again? Yes, paralyzing. This is terrible. Okay, get ready. This is really terrible. Wayne won't find this hard to believe. We had some guys in the dormitories that kept some large snakes at Oklahoma Christian. And if you put a snake in the shower with a board and you drop a mouse in there, at a certain point the mouse may attack the snake just out of absolute desperation because he just can't stand it any longer. And it's not going to be a good conclusion, but at a certain point just the fear causes him to do something that's just not rational at all. And you think, God comes to Abraham and says, Abraham, don't be afraid. Jesus walking on the water. Talk about kind of scaring the life out of you. Okay, Don't be afraid. And so, while we're not going to talk primarily about fear, it will be mentioned tonight. Every time there's a psalm that is written, something has happened, and the actual events are not given to us. We're not given any kind of hints or details, other than the consensus of people that I read feel like Israel has survived some type of either attack, they have been threatened, something has taken place, and there were any number of times that Jerusalem and Israel was attacked. And on the other side of that, with all the danger that was involved, then this psalm is written, which then describes both the potential and the possibility of fear, but a spiritual and a biblical way to replace fear from our knowledge of God. And let me say this. In no way at all am I critical when we are afraid. There are things we need to be afraid of. And this is going to sound a little bit backhanded, but for he who said, "Do not be anxious about anything, but by prayer and supplications let your requests be made known to God," he talks about, we went and we heard about this church and we didn't hear anything, and I was so anxious that I couldn't preach the gospel there and I had to go on. And I'm thinking, isn't it nice to see Paul as anxious as we are sometimes? Because that's just a part of being human. So I'm not putting any of us down, because we all will have times of proper concern and fear. However, psalms like this are also written to also give us an alternative to just being afraid, just being anxious, and just being paralyzed by fear. And so hopefully that will help us with that. The command, Isaiah 41:10, underline, "Do not fear," and see, here it comes, "I am with you." And that's what's going to be repeated over and over in our psalm, is that it's not that fear itself is irrational, because fear is very rational, but when you then put God in the equation, we're on a whole different footing and a whole different standing than if we're dealing with this just by ourselves. This is totally other than separate, but just let me say this. Do you remember that passage? "There's no temptation that is taking you, but such is common to man. And God is faithful," and I always add, in Corinth, God is faithful, "and with the temptation, what will God do? He will provide a way of escape." And I ask myself sometimes, when I have failed with the temptation, how hard was I looking for the way of escape? Okay, we're all going to sin. I'm not minimizing that. But do we have to? Are we going to say that God's just going to leave us in a position that we're just so overwhelmed with temptation that we just have to sin? And so instead of just kind of going through life and engaging every temptation that comes along, there is a way of escape that God has provided, but we have to be the ones who look for it. There is an antidote to people who are paralyzed by fear, but they have to draw on their relationship to God to deal with that. If they just leave it within their own ability and their own self, then they're not going to succeed in the process of doing that. So if you go back to the first page, and we always have some people who haven't been in class before, so I'll do this very quickly. Quick commercial. If you have never done this before, my favorite spiritual discipline is starting the first of the month to read 5 chapters of Psalms a day and 1 chapter from Proverbs. Virtually every January since 1976, then I always start the new year, and you start and think the first and the greatest commandment is to love God with your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength. And I think I'm going to read through Israel and the early church's hymn book to strengthen the vertical relationship I have with God. And the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And we all need wisdom continually as we grow in different situations that we have. And so this is why I love doing a class like this, because several hundreds of times through the years, then I've read through the book of Psalms, and here's what's interesting. It's amazing how something will happen in our lives that opens the door to something that's been in Scripture all along, and we'll see something at a point in time that we didn't see earlier. I've mentioned this in a previous class. We'll do it real quick. As our kids were teenagers, I would take them to school, and one of the things we would do is we'd have a series of proverbs that we'd work on. Fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Good names be chosen better than riches. But, and I don't know why, but one of the ones we talked about is that he who meddles in a quarrel that is not his own is like a man who grabs a passing dog by the ear. And I just tell our girls, I said, you know, if you're walking through a park and you grab a German Shepherd by the ears as he trots by, he's going to bite you. Our chances are pretty good. Well, I picked up our middle daughter in the 8th grade, and we're starting the way home, and she's pretty quiet. And Heather just quietly says, Dad, I got bit today. And Wayne, I'm thinking bandage, Band-Aid, teeth marks or something, you know, because that's all she said. She says, Dad, I got bit today. And you're thinking, you hope in the 8th grade that we've kind of grown out of that by now. And I said, Heather, what on earth happened? And all she said was, I meddled in a quarrel that was not my own. Do you see what I'm saying? That verse meant something to her. We had talked, I mean, she knew it by memory, but I promise you the next time she read that verse, it would mean something to her then that it hadn't meant before. And fear and being afraid is a normal part of the human predicament, the human situation. And that's why I love reading things like this, because they help equip us to cope with and to deal with the different things that are come up in life. So here's our central idea on the first page, CI. Our knowledge of God allows us to not be afraid. And like I said, this is not 100%, but what I am talking about is just living in a state of fear. I've just talked with people sometimes who are just so burdened. I've known a couple of people, if something bad hadn't happened, they started worrying because nothing had happened yet. Just always on the edge of anxiety. And our knowledge of God should free us from that, and that's part of what we'll look at as we go through. And I want us to describe how our knowledge of God impacts our level of worry and fear. Now, here's a quick note, and we don't repeat everything. But the first book, and Psalms is written in 5 different books. The first book will go from chapter 1 all the way down through chapter 41, and 38 of the 41 Psalms are written by David. And in all of these Psalms, the predominant use for God is, and all 4 of them are capitalized, L-O-R-D, capital L, capital O, capital R-D. And the general consensus is that toward the end of the Old Testament, as God's people goes into captivity, the original word there was probably Yahweh, the holy name of God given to Moses at the burning bush. But God's people did not want pagans to be able to swear and to curse the holy name of God. And so instead of having Yahweh there, then they put capital, all 4, L-O-R-D. And so in the first book, 1 through 41, and see, we just know this by nature, the Lord is my shepherd. And so when you read through that first book, then the preference for the holy name of God, and probably David wrote Yahweh. And you think as many times as we've heard the 23rd Psalm, how different would it just sound by way of rhythm if we just said, oh, Yahweh is my shepherd, I shall not want, because we're so accustomed to the word Lord. When you come to the second book, which starts in chapter 42, the editors of the second book preferred the word Elohim, E-L-O-H-I-M, and it will just be God. And yes, Lord will be used occasionally, but the predominant use of the holy name of God is Elohim. And again, quickly, anytime in English you see El in a Hebrew word, it has something to do with God. Israel, he who wrestles with God. Daniel, he who is strong. Ezekiel, when you get to listening to it, we have all of these names that have El in them. And in the Old Testament, this will be some derivative of God. And so when you come to chapter 42, and like I said, we're going to be reading in 46, then predominantly, and like ours will start, God is our refuge and strength. So I think there are different editors. We have 5 different books, and the editors in book number 2 preferred Elohim rather than God, rather than Lord or Yahweh. And let me just do this very quickly. There are up to 30 different derivatives of names for God. And a part of the beauty of this is that different times circumstances have happened where, well, and I've told you this, but just again real quick. She's probably 25 years old, has been a Christian less than a year. We're at a retreat. And she says, I really need to talk. And I said, who knows, 2 o'clock, whatever, afternoon tea, we'll talk. And bless her heart, your heart just goes out to her. She said, my physical father abused me physically, mentally, and emotionally. And I just said, bless your heart. I am so sorry. She said, I really struggle to pray, our Father who art in heaven, because my earthly father inflicted so much hurt on me. Is God displeased if I can't call him Father? And I says, no, bless your heart. Again, Yahweh, El Shaddai is the name that Abraham knew. There are other names of God, and I said, hopefully by his grace, God will help to heal you from this in his own time, but don't feel guilty today because you can't pray today, our Father who art in heaven, because of what was done to you by your physical father. And so that's where, again, these different names of God, he's bigger than any one name. But as you move into the second book, then we'll notice that he is predominantly God. And so we've mentioned this. Here's the second line. This psalm seems to have been written after God had delivered his people from an impending crisis, maybe an invasion. And in many ways, it reminds one of a poetic rendering of the word Emmanuel. Do you remember what the word Emmanuel is? God with us. And there's like this, again, we're in the book of Matthew, there's like this parentheses. You will call his name Emmanuel, meaning God with us. And then how does it close just before he goes back to heaven? All authority has been given me in heaven and earth. Go make disciples of all nations. I am with you. And the idea of God with us in the flesh is so important in Matthew. And so, having survived some type of an event, then this psalm is written. And notice how often there's just this personal tie, this personal relationship, where the writer of this psalm feels this absolute heartfelt gratitude for the connection and the relationship that he has with God. Different translations will render it differently. One will say, God is our fortress, God is our refuge. And again, these are the sons of Korah. When you read through the second book, 41 down through 72, it will be edited by the sons of Korah. When you come to the third book, 73 through 106, it will be edited by the sons of Asaph. So there are musical families, and we talked about the family of Asaph earlier. We can account for 600 years of faithful worship, and here is a psalm at least included in the edition done by the sons of Korah. Psalm 46, verse 1. God is our refuge and our strength, a very present help in time of trouble. And just kind of, I hope this doesn't seem strange, but I think sometimes when I read Scripture, I want to taste something with my ear in terms of kind of holding it the same way that we taste good food with our tongue and our mouth. And just let that first line just kind of sink in. God, and again, Elohim, he's not going to use Lord because this is the second book. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in time of trouble. Therefore, we will not fear. That to me is like the thesis statement, kind of the center thought for the whole psalm. Because, and again, it's not the human side, it's not their ingenuity, it's not their hard work, their creativity. The focus is God, refuge and strength, a very present help in times of trouble. Therefore, we will not fear. And then 4 of these are mentioned, and they're just given in succession. And these are physical things. Though the earth gives way, though the mountains be moved into the heart of the sea, and though its waters roar and foam, and though the mountains tremble at its swelling. We're going to go ahead and mention this lovely little word, and different people pronounce it different. I pronounce it Selah. No one knows exactly what it means precisely. It's used 71 times in the book of Psalms. One of the editors that I read, he said, yes, it may be kind of like a rest or something, but he said, when I hear the word Selah, I hear the writer saying, now just think about it. Stop and think about it. And so what we're going to have through this short psalm, we're going to have 3 different times that they'll give a few verses, a main thought, and then he's going to say, now think about it. Verse 4, and here's the irony. There is no literal river in Jerusalem. There's an underground stream. But look at the descriptions. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy habitation of the Most High. God is in the midst of her. She shall not be moved. God will help her when morning dawns. The nations rage, the kingdoms totter. He utters his voice, the earth melts. And this refrain is going to be in verse 7, and it will end the psalm. The Lord of hosts is with us, and the God of Jacob is our fortress. Do you hear how often, again, using our New Testament term, Emmanuel, God with us, and how many different ways the writer is talking about God is with us, protecting us, shielding us, caring for us, looking after us. And we'll come back and talk about this expression, the Lord of hosts and the God of Jacob, here in just a second. Verse 8. Come behold the works of the Lord. And give me just 2 seconds. Let me just... One of the verses that just always stands out to me is Psalms 111, verse 2. Great are the works of the Lord, studied by all who have pleasure in them. And you stop and think, there is we had relatives in Carlsbad, and we would go out to the deserts of New Mexico. There's an amazing amount of life in a desert that you don't see if you drive through at 70 miles an hour. I mean, there really is, isn't there? And whether you're in the mountains, whether you're in a marsh, wherever you are, just the magnitude of the works of God, and we're talking about these in terms of our physical earth, is just absolutely stunning. And you just stop and think, how often do the heavens proclaim the majesty of God? The heavens declare the glory of God. The firmament showeth his handiwork. Day to day, they speak forth, but not a sound is made. And all around us is this amazing visual reminder of both the creativity and the love of color and design. I've been here long enough, the secretaries don't just go, oh no. I just sometimes say, I'm going up to the Sea of Galilee today. Yes, I know I'm a long ways from Palestine. It's amazing how much life takes place in a lake in a year. Right now we have, I don't know what they are, we have thousands of these little bitty white birds, and while the water's down, and then at a point in time, here's going to come 40 or 50 or 60 pelicans. And it's just absolutely amazing through the cycle of a year how much diversity of wildlife there is just in one place. If you grew up in a county that got 12 to 17 inches of rain a year, and my dad said we get half of that in one night, being close to a body of water I don't ever get tired of. And so I'll just go up and we're going to hear this in a second, be still, and just open my eyes and just watch at this kaleidoscope of color and design and everything else. And then I get to thinking, oh yes, and he spoke that into existence. Absolutely amazing. Verse 8, come behold the works of the Lord. He has wrought desolations on the earth. He makes wars to cease to the end of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the chariots with fire. And here's a verse for you just to tuck away in your heart and your memory. Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. Because of lack of time, we won't probably be able to look at these, but when we come into the third book, Psalms 74 and 79 are written after the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. And all of these psalms have just such a connection with the heart and with things that have happened. And later, those events are going to produce psalms the same way that this psalm has been produced, probably from some type of victory, some type of deliverance. And God has delivered the people. The word Salah, Selah, you'll hear different pronunciations. And we're going to see this another thing. When I read this, I just have the term think about it. It may have had other musical notations, but like I said, 71 times it will be used in the Psalms. And it's like the psalmist will say something down through verse 3, and then it's like, okay, just take a deep breath and pause and think about it. And 3 different times then that exhortation is given here. But notice descriptions of God, and we're going to do a couple of these. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in times of trouble. One of the things that we'll probably do is there's about 7 or 8 psalms that are written by David when he is being chased by King Saul. Okay, nobody in antiquity would know the song "Man on the Run," but I start reading these and I keep hearing "Man on the Run," and you stop and think. Every time you lay your head down at night, you don't know if you're going to see the next day, because the king, and Harold Shank thinks maybe for 22 years, is chasing David. And here's what's amazing. Saul is pursuing David, and David is the man after God's own heart, and David is pursuing God. And even something as threatening and something as troubling and something as just, shaped his whole life probably for 2 decades, could not take his mind off of the pursuit of God. we worked for nearly 2 years with South Walker, merged, became Southern Oaks while we were at OC. And one of my dear, dear friends was John Hanna, and John's wife had passed away. They had sat down when they first got married. They had a 50, 60-year plan for their life, and John Hanna was still on the plan, even though his wife was gone home. Every 6 months, John moved every stick of furniture in his house and polished the floor and the woodwork, because that's what his wife would have liked to have done. And he said, son, you probably put on the same sock first each morning, and you start your day in a rut. He said, every day I'm conscious that I put a different sock on rather than just doing the same one. And he said, and you probably shave in the same, and I thought about this today, I still shave differently a little bit every day so I don't start my day. So he was just a fabulous, fabulous mentor. We come back from Australia and talked with someone, and they said, John Hanna doesn't have long to live. They had exploratory surgery, and they just said the cancer so far, they just sewed him up, and the doctor said, you need to put your house in order. And John Hanna said, sir, my house has been in order for 60 years. And so I go get to talk with him in a care facility in South Oklahoma City. And just with that gleam and that smile, he said, you know, since I have gotten cancer, I've been able to talk with more people about the Lord than I ever did when I was healthy. They're getting paid to have to take care of me, so they can't just leave when I bring up the Lord. And he said, before I got cancer, some people would want to talk and some people didn't. And he said, one of the greatest blessings in my life is that now that I've had cancer, they have to come in and take care of me. And so they're going to get an earful the whole time that they're here, because they can't just close the door and leave, because they're being paid to take care of me. And he said, one of the greatest spiritual blessings that I've ever had in my life is getting cancer. Do you see what we're talking about? When God is our refuge and our strength, very present help in time of trouble. While I was gone, our dear friend Charlie Powell passed away at Britton Road. My only regret is that he beat us home. And see, when God comes in the picture, all the things that happen in this life take a whole different view and a whole different dimension than people who live their lives without God. The Lord of hosts is with us. Verse 7, the God of Jacob is our fortress, and that will be repeated in verse 11. So let's look at the second page, and these will just obviously be some highlights. Those who have their refuge in God are free from fear, and I'm talking about just a paralyzing fear that just grips us, and it's like we're victims and we can't ever do anything different about that. There's dozens. I just picked. Look at these samples of refuge. 5:11. Let all who take refuge in you rejoice. Let them ever sing for joy. Spread your protection over them. Psalm 7:1. My God, in you do I take refuge. Save me from my pursuers and deliver me. David. In the Lord I take refuge. And how can you say, flee like a bird to your mountain? Preserve me, O God, for in you I take refuge. But the other term that's here, and refuge obviously has a lot of connotations, and we'll look at this with David. When you're a man on the run, as long as he is, hiding in caves and behind rocks and all this other stuff, look at how the terminology of how he lived for 2 decades fleeing from Saul becomes a part of the terminology of his Psalms. Strength was the one I wouldn't have noticed right off. 28:7, the Lord is my strength and my shield. In him my heart trusts, and I am helped. 28:8, the Lord is the strength of his people. 29:1, ascribe to the Lord, O heavenly beings, ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Therefore the Lord gives strength to his people. And so when the psalmist says, therefore we will not fear, I just wanted to put these just and highlight them and lift them out for just a second. The first set are all physical things. The earth gives way, mountains be moved, the waters roar and foam, the mountains tremble. And then here comes this little term, Selah. Stop and think about it. God is both protector, refuge, and strength for daily living. So those who have their refuge in God are free from fear. I'm talking about the paralyzing type of fear. The second group of verses, those who have refuge in God are immovable, not because of them, but because of God. The nations will rise up against God's people. He's the source of physical and spiritual safety. God's habitation will become their habitation. And notice, and always look at this in different contexts, look at the different descriptions of God that are just in this one psalm. Elohim is God, the holy habitation of the Most High. And again, you just have a whole different concept of God when he's spoken of as the Most High. The Lord of hosts is with us. And when you look at 2:3, there's two thoughts about this. On the one hand, the Lord of hosts, the host may be the heavenly bodies, stars, planets, etc., etc. Sometimes that is descriptive of that. And both with the Hubble spacecraft, and I was watching a documentary. I took a ham radio class when I was in Sydney. We moved in April, and in July we had a month-long communication. Everything shut down for a month. And I don't know anything about electronics, but I'm going to take a class and get a ham radio so I'm not subject to some union not being able to talk. Our teacher was a part of a mile-long railroad track with these huge satellite discs listening for stars and heavenly beings that we haven't been able to see yet. And you stop and think, if you're on the southern part of the earth, there's a whole part of the universe that we can't see on this side. And so his job was they were listening, and they'd have all these different huge satellite discs on this mile-long thing, and once they kind of found one, and then they'd send this to an observatory to see if they could track that down. It's stunning. And you see some of these constellations, and they look like flowers and like plants and all this other stuff. Lord of hosts. The second one is, though, the angels, the heavenly beings. Myriads upon myriads of angels and heavenly beings. You can kind of choose whichever way you want to go, because sometimes Lord of hosts is the physical planets, and then the other side is the heavenly beings. Brother McCord visited us while we were first living in Sydney, and we went to a Bible class, and I was able to ask him a question. I just asked, what do you want to ask God when you get there? And if you knew Brother McCord, he usually woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning, studied an hour of Hebrew, an hour of Greek, ran 2 miles. So his 8 o'clock class was the middle of the day for Brother McCord. And I just thought, what would he say? And his first response was, why did you make it so big? I said, pardon? He said, even today, we have no idea, literally, of how big the universe is. And one of the things that I want to ask God is, why did you make it so big? Lord of hosts, whether the design of the planet spoken into existence or the myriad of angels is with us. But isn't this interesting? The God of Jacob. When you look in the book of Psalms, Abraham is used 4 times, Isaac once, and Jacob is used 34 times. And you think, well, why would you choose Jacob? Well, let's try Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin, and then we throw in a little sister, Diana, however you want to pronounce it, the nation of Israel. And in Psalms, God will primarily be referred to as the God of Jacob. I don't know why, but just notice that's the reference that's there. So those who have refuge are immovable, and then they are victorious. God will come to the aid of his people. But just speak for myself. When we all get stressful and worried, which we will do, one of the hardest things to do is just to stop and be still and know that I'm God. This to me is a intentional, trained response. We won't do this automatically because that's just not a part of human nature. But look, with all these things that are going on, the psalmist just has this wonderful little passage. He says, okay, be still and know that I'm God. And out of all the things that we can do when we're anxious and when we're worried, which those things will happen to us, then here's one of those verses that we need to tuck away, and not just as an excuse and not just kind of as a Band-Aid, but just as a lifestyle. With whatever's taking place, then yes, this has happened, this is what we know, there's concern about this, but God is still calling us to be still and know that I'm God. 3:4 on the very bottom, I thought this was very interesting. The exhortation, be still, calls on them to stop doing one thing in favor of doing something else. Whatever you were doing, stop. And instead of that, be still. Stop the impulse of fear by replacing fear by focusing on God and seeking His refuge, His strength, and the protection of His fortress. So if you'll turn to the very back page, and I'll mention this for you just to look at. In our hymn book, Psalm number 10 is titled, A Mighty Fortress is Our God. And during the Reformation in the 1500s, Martin Luther is literally being hunted. They would have killed him if they could have caught him at different times. He's being hunted by the Roman Church. And from that, the reading of Psalm 46, a mighty fortress is our God, a bulwark never failing. And I'll leave you to look at the song, and there's other terms that are there, but the sense of God being the fortress and the protection is given there. We're going to close. I'm on the third page, and you see the term Jesus. We're like 3 paragraphs up from the very bottom. So we just have a few final things, and we'll close with this tonight. Jesus frequently instructs his followers, fear not or be of good cheer. And I would be too. They are terrified at the sight of him walking on water. Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid. Jesus' words remind us that even in the midst of the storm, we can trust his power and presence to calm our fears and bring us peace. Fear can paralyze us and neutralize our efforts to live for God. And just let that soak in. Fear can actually paralyze us and neutralize our efforts to live for God. The command to fear not is not just a suggestion or a piece of advice, but it is a command from God himself. Fear is the natural human response to danger and uncertainty, but it can also be a barrier to trusting in God's providence and sovereignty. And think about this, fear and peace cannot cohabit the human heart simultaneously. Now, I am not saying that the next time you're afraid that you're not a good Christian. That's not what I'm saying. But like I said, through the years, I've talked with people. My mom was one of these. If she didn't know if something was wrong, then that's what worried her, because she knew something was coming along that would be wrong, and so she had to start worrying about what hadn't happened yet, because that would, and you've met people like that. They just kind of go perpetually from one fear to another. Fear and peace cannot cohabit the human heart at the same time. As believers, we are called to put our faith in God's promises and to trust that he is in control no matter what circumstances we face. So the psalmist's knowledge of God, God's name, his nature, and his covenant leads the writer to speak about God in terms of physical safety. God's protection is communicated through descriptive terms. God is refuge. God is our strength. God is our shelter, and whatever may be the storm, the psalmist declares that he will trust in God to be a very present help in times of trouble. A few years ago, I went through a period of time where I was just unsettled, which is very uncharacteristic. If you've been around me, I don't go real high, I don't go real low. I'm just kind of pretty well level most of the time, but I was just struggling with a lot of things. And I talked with a dear friend, and we were just talking about this, and he said, I can just tell that you're just anxious, you're not quite where you normally are. And he says, I have one piece of advice for you. And he said, when you feel anxious, he said, rather than just trying to do the whole thing, he said, can you just quietly say the word trust? Trust. So help me, what does trust mean to a Christian that doesn't mean to a non-Christian? What does the word trust mean to you as a Christian that doesn't mean to a non-Christian? Help me. He's going to help carry the burden. He is in control. I'm struggling with control right now, but he is in control. I'm not in this by myself. And that's not a magic wand, but sometimes having something that's very specific and very doable is better than having a whole lot of things that we can't get our hand on. For years, I've told young people at camp, one verse that you live by is better than a whole Bible that's shut. And the next time, and it will happen to all of us, this is a human nature, the next time that you are feeling anxious about things, can I pass this on? One of the things that's really helped me is just to kind of stop, take a couple of deep breaths, and just reframe what's going on within the context of the word trust. And as you can see, Psalm 46 then becomes a very important part of this because God is our refuge and our strength. God is a very present help in times of trouble. Therefore, we will not fear. Brother McCord referred to Jacob as heel grabber. Heel grabber. Cheat his brothers if he could, always trying to get ahead. And God used a rascal like that to have 12 sons and become he who struggles with God, the father of the nation. And I still kind of laugh. Throughout Scripture, the he who is eternal and he who is spirit is known by three characters. I am the God of Abraham. I'm God of Isaac. And I'm the God of heel grabber. The guy who had in some ways more imperfections than perfections. And God's plan and God's will was not limited by human frailty. And one of the verses in the book of Hebrews that was true with he who slept on a rock for a pillow one night while running away from his schemes and his troubles. The God of Jacob, Emmanuel, is faithful, and that God has said, I will never leave you, and I will never forsake you.